Hi, everybody, and welcome. Just wanted to let you know we're going to wait another minute or two to let everybody sign in. My name is Robin Starr, and we are so happy that you could join us for Highballs and Highlights. So go ahead and mix your drink, and we'll get started officially in just a couple of minutes. Hi, I think we're going to go ahead and get underway. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robin Starr. I'm the head of the American and European Works of Art Department, and we are thrilled to have you here this afternoon for what we're calling Highballs and Highlights. Hopefully you got the recipe and went ahead and made your beverage. If you don't want to try our signature drink, the going once, going twice, please feel free to enjoy whatever beverage suits you most. We are, as you probably know, here at Skinner's, we hold auctions of prints, photographs, and fine art, but we also have auctions, over 60 a year, in fact, that include American decorative arts, European furniture, Asian works of art, wines, jewelry, 20th century design. We have a huge range of things that we sell. So we're so happy to have you here. Before we start talking about some of the highlights in the painting sale, just want to talk a little bit about cocktails at home. Now, a few people are lucky enough to have a bar in their house, but most of us don't. Most of us don't even have a bar cart. But you don't need a special bar or cart to have a cool looking bar. We've assembled one very quickly just with things here. We're using a Wendell Castle sculpture table called Starry Night as our bar. And we've added to it some other things, including an Hermès sterling silver wine cooler, as well as some other bar accoutrements. And all of these items are coming up in our 20th century design sale, which is running online from June 8th through June 16th. Since we're here and we're talking about bars, I thought the best place to begin was at the old Ritz-Carlton bar in Boston. So let me give you to my colleague, Liz Haff, and she'll take us for a tour of the Ritz-Carlton bar.
Welcome, everyone. So glad you're with us this evening. I want to start our tour with a little bit of history about the Ritz. Back in 1927, Edward Weiner was in the process of building an apartment building at the corner of Arlington and Newbury Street. He was up 2 floors of this apartment building when he heard from Mayor Curley that what the town needed was a high-end hotel. I guess Mayor Curley could be pretty persuasive. So Mr. Weiner decided that yes, he would indeed build a hotel. He wanted a hotel that was going to be built around luxury, and what better way to establish a reputation for luxury than the Ritz name. So he went to the Ritz Investment Company and to the Ritz in Paris and got permission to use their name. And he went ahead and built his hotel that opened in March of 1927, and the first room rates were $15 a night. We have about 30 paintings from the Ritz collection in our sale this time. And most of the artists are British, most born from the mid-19th century and lived through the first quarter of the 20th century. They run a span of genres from costumes, historical pieces, portraits, let's see, hunting scenes, some floral still lifes, just the sorts of genres that you would expect. And why these brought so much a sense of gentility to the hotel, a sense of warmth, of tradition, and of craftsmanship. The hotel was quite conservative until the 1960s. At first, you were scrutinized if you wanted a reservation. They wanted to know that you were in the social register or in Who's Who. They also scrutinized the letter paper that people used to write to request reservations at the hotel. There was a strict dress code for the guests, and also it was very restrictive about who could dine in the restaurants. Ladies were not permitted to dine together in the cafe, period. And no unescorted women were permitted into the Ritz bar until 1970. So fortunately, we're past 1970 now, and I'm going to invite us to make our way into the Ritz bar. And while you were on your way to the lounge and looking out over Arlington Street, you might have seen this lovely painting, which is by James Carl Beckwith, an American artist. And Beckwith was actually raised in the Midwest until 1871, when after the Great Fire in Chicago, his father lost his business and the family had to relocate and they chose New York. Fortunately for Beckwith, it was great because he went to the Art Students League. After the Art Students League, he went to Paris and he was both a student and a studio assistant for Carolus Duran. In that same studio was John Singer Sargent, and the two men were friends. After Paris, he returned to New York and he taught at the Art Students League along with William Merritt Chase. And he and Chase were some of the major teachers at that time at the Art Students League. Chase became more of an impressionist. Beckwith stayed more in a kind of a Boston school type painting. Here you see in this painting, this lovely woman emerging from the darkness. You can't really see much of the details of the room. It's hidden in the shadows, but there's strong light that comes in from the right. And it just highlights her lovely porcelain décolletage, her beautiful, graceful hand and long fingers. It glances off of the bowl and on the edge of this polished wood table. So picking up the highlights in the painting. I think looking at this elegant woman, she probably would have made the cut as a customer for the Ritz. The next painting in the bar that you might have seen, and they hung close together, was this work by Percy Moran. Should I? I'll go this way, you go that way. So Percy Moran was born in Philadelphia. He came from a very artistic family. His father was Edward Moran, a noted marine painter, and his uncle was Thomas Moran, who was well known for painting wonderful landscapes of the American West and of the California coast. Percy Moran, however, turned his attention to historical scenes, and this one shows the Boston Tea Party, very appropriate for the hotel. He tended not to be hugely historically accurate with these paintings. They're more to give a sense of the action and activity and excitement of the event. Other typical scenes he painted were Betsy Ross presenting the first American flag to a very admiring George Washington, or the colonists buying the island of Manhattan from the Native Americans, or George Washington's triumphant return to Mount Vernon. So here we see the Boston Tea Party that was called back in the day the destruction of the tea. It was never called the Boston Tea Party. And you see the colonists who were disguised in Indian garb. This again is quite inaccurate because none of them would have been wearing feathered headdresses. This is just more to add to the glory and excitement of the scene. So moving down a little further in the bar, we get to some of the hunting scenes that were so popular. And this is by William Shaw, or School of William Shaw. And it's very typical of British paintings. He was active in the last years of the 18th century. These paintings very typically show off a prized animal, whether it's a dog or a horse, often shown rather large scale and in silhouette. Usually the backgrounds are quite simple. They'll be just a green grass and maybe a groom holding the horse's lead. In this case, though, the dog, who's quite sizable, is shown here with a scene of the hunt going on in the background. I'm just going to bend down to show you their hounds passing through here, their horses and riders galloping through the background here, and two gentlemen in top hats are approaching up a hill towards the foxhound. And this painting hung over the paneled fireplace in the bar. So keeping with the dog thing, we're going to backtrack a little bit, if you don't mind, down here to these two handsome fellows. Here you have Punch and Carlo. I don't know if they'll be familiar to you, but they hung in the lobby of the Ritz for many years, overseeing the comings and goings of the guests. This is by Elmsley, and he was a great painter of dogs and also dogs and children. Very sweet and sentimental pictures of Victorian childhood, and they were so popular in his lifetime. They appeared in periodicals, they appeared as painted tiles, and those things are still collectible today. But this is a more restrained painting. We have this dark terrier and that rather pudgy dachshund, and they're shown here against an elegant background with some potted palms, a Turkey carpet, and then some Turkish-inspired embroidery there. Elmsley was really a wonderful painter of animals. And we're going to segue from that into what is one of the real strengths of the Ritz collection, which are these costume genre pieces. And I'll just quickly point out this, which is the Garden of the Tuileries, painted in 1882 by a Swedish artist whose name is Hagborg. And below this is another one of my favorites. This is called the Gallant Salute by, oh gosh, it's just out of my brain, Samuel Waller. But the one I really want to dwell on is a few steps this way, if you don't mind returning this direction. So this is a wonderful scene by Walter Denby Sadler. And we spent a lot of time looking at this. One of the joys of these kinds of pieces is that they're lavish in detail, which is just lovely to behold. But also they seem to tell a story, but often we don't really know what the story is. And this one, according to the presentation plaque, is called The Introduction. And here we have this beautiful library with glass doors over the shelves. We have a lovely, again, a Turkey carpet, a fur rug in front of the hearth. The clock tells us it's 3:30. We have an older gentleman who's presenting a young woman who's curtsying to 3 young men on the right-hand side. We know there's a story here, but we just don't know quite what it is. So one of the curious things about this is, well, first of all, the expressions of these young men. Each has something to say about this introduction. This fellow looks to be like a deer in the headlights. He's just not engaging at all. This young man, whose profile is remarkably similar to that, we figure these are this man's sons, is looking down his nose at this young woman. And this young man with things under his arm, books, seems to be ready to bolt out of the room. Another curious detail is here on the seat of this chair, there seem to be at least 1 and perhaps 2 pearl necklaces in presentation boxes. So no one really knows what the story is of this painting, but we have a lot of fun trying to figure it out and being a detective about the marvelous details. I have to confess that my most recent idea is that actually these 3 young men are being presented with someone who might be their future stepmother. So continuing in the narrative tradition, we have up here a work by Dean Cornwell. And Dean Cornwell is certainly, is certainly one of the most famous American illustrators active in the first half of the 20th century. He was very much working in the vein of Howard Pyle and the Brandywine School of Illustration. He again was extremely adept at the interiors and at capturing light as it comes across this lovely couple, catches the samovar and the candelabra, the beautiful japanned chest with the oriental vase above. One of the things that I had the most fun with about this painting is looking at the portraits, the very large portraits up in the upper corners. And I was able to identify the one on the left as a copy of Gainsborough's portrait of Mary Robinson. And Mary Robinson was a very charismatic character. She was, in the 18th century, she was an actress and a writer, and she caught the attention of the Prince of Wales, later Edward IV. And this portrait was actually commissioned by the Prince of Wales from Gainsborough in 1781. And it now hangs in the Wallace collection in London. And the only difference I could really see is that in the Wallace collection picture, she has her dog in the lower right-hand corner. That's kind of obscured by the shadow cast by the man standing in the front. And just before we finish off our tour of the Ritz, I want to show you one other painting that's become a real favorite. and it's this work by a Viennese artist whose name is Leah Reinhardt. And I pointed out to you because of all the artists that we have in this Ritz collection, she's the youngest by far. She passed away in 1970. She was trained in Vienna, and she was really a painter of miniatures and still lifes. And often they would feature figurines, which would provide the activity within the work, and then beautiful flowers and so forth. So just lovely still lives. She also did interiors, and I think it's interesting, this becomes like an expanded still life. Again, she's very caught up in the gorgeous chandelier, the golden decoration on the wall panels, the garniture, the reflections in the parquet floor. But one of the things that attracted me most about this, and actually what reminds me of the work of Walter Gay, is that you have the sense that people perhaps have been here. There's something about the arrangement of the furniture, which is somewhat informal for a salon like this. And they're being presided over, if you will, by this large structure, which is actually an 18th century stove. So they sat there for warmth, and it feels as though they just left their chairs and stepped out of the frame of the painting. Now, this room that's shown here is a fairly famous one. It's the Salon of Empress Elizabeth in the Schonbrunn Palace. And the Schonbrunn Palace takes its name from the artesian well from which the water is drawn for the residents, and Schonbrunn translating as beautiful fountain. So we'll continue our walking. We'll leave the Ritz now, and I invite you to stroll across Arlington Street and into the public garden, and where you will meet my colleague, Kate Leland.
Hi there, I'm Kate Leland, and I chose just a few of my favorite things from the sale to talk to you about. So rather than having one big consignment from one place with a good story like the Ritz, I just chose a few favorite things. So the first group is a group of works by Boston artist Arthur Clifton Goodwin. And Liz is not wrong. We are just stepping right across Arlington Street, especially with this painting. I think the Ritz is probably right over here. This is the statue of George Washington in the public gardens. This lovely family group here sitting on a park bench just near Arlington Street. And this is the Arlington Street Church spire here. So Goodwin is was a Boston painter. He started painting around the turn of the century, so around 1900. He was not young at that time. He was 40, so he didn't start painting until later in life. These early paintings, these three works are early, from right around the turn of the century, and this other work down here is later, probably closer to 1920. He painted in Boston between 1900 and 1920, went to New York for 10 years, then came back to Boston. He was from Boston, did not train as an artist, became friends with another Boston artist named Louis Kronberg, who painted ballerinas predominantly in pastel and also in paint, oil paint. And this work by Goodwin is a pastel. Goodwin often worked in pastel as well, maybe partly probably because he was friends with Kronberg, but maybe also because he was plagued throughout his life with alcoholism and insecure finances. So I think that pastels were something he liked, but also something, the materials were less expensive. So pastels themselves and the paper that you draw them on cost less than oil paints and canvas. But these three works are all, like I said, early works. And as I mentioned, Goodwin never traveled to France. He, though he would have liked to, and he obviously was influenced by Impressionism. That wasn't hard to come by around 1900 in Boston. Boston collectors were some of the first collectors anywhere in the world of Impressionism. They greatly appreciated Impressionism. They sponsored early exhibitions in the 1880s and 90s in Boston of Impressionist paintings, and many prominent Bostonians purchased Impressionist paintings. Goodwin was close friends with John Taylor Spalding, who was a great benefactor of the Museum of Fine Arts and gave his massive collection to them upon his death, including 8 Goodwins. But because he was friends with Spalding, he was able to see paintings by Manet, Monet, Cassatt, Renoir, and also more modern works by Matisse, Van Gogh, Gauguin. They were all in John Taylor Spalding's collection. And you can really see in these two paintings, especially this one below, that Goodwin definitely had seen French Impressionist paintings. I mean, these look like paintings of the Tuileries or the Luxembourg. This one reminiscent a little bit of Cassatt, or more so with these children. This of maybe Renoir, or even bits of Manet with this sunlight dappling on the ground, the distinct brushstrokes. Here Goodwin is painting with dense paint, kind of more dense color. And this painting here is later, 1920s. The colors are less dark, they're lighter, brighter. And this is kind of an iconic scene that Goodwin painted over and over again. This view of the Park Street Church, this view up Tremont Street on the Common, groups of people walking. He painted en plein air like the Impressionists. He painted scenes of everyday life, also like the Impressionists. And he painted this scene as well as a view of Copley Plaza and Boylston Street and some views of the Tea Wharves in Boston over and over and over again, much like Monet's series of haystacks or the Houses of Parliament or the Rouen Cathedral. Goodwin painted these in different weather, different times of year, different light. And this one is really lovely. We see a lot of Goodwins. He was a Boston artist. Like I said, he was prolific. He needed money. So he sometimes, especially later in life, painted quickly and tried to sell as many paintings and pastels as possible. So we do see a lot, many Boston collectors of these works, but these are some of the best ones we've seen in a long time, I think. This painting, these people remind me a lot of the work of Maurice Prendergast. The figures aren't as fully fleshed out as these over here. They're more just almost little thumbprints of paint. And the rest of the landscape is very muted. The trees are very linear, very loose painting style he was using at this time in 1920. So like I said, he went to New York between 1921 and 1929, then returned to Boston. When he came back to Boston, his marriage had ended. He wasn't doing well. He had probably been drinking more than he had previous in the past years when he was in New York. He was able, though, to paint a good deal and sell some paintings. And so he had enough money finally to buy a ticket to Paris, which was his dream of going there and painting the streets of Paris like he painted the streets of New York and Boston. Unfortunately, in May of the year he came back, he passed away. And when his friends found him in his studio, his trunk was packed with his ticket on the steamship to Paris on top of it. He was ready to go, but he never did make it. So sad story, but beautiful paintings. Now we're going to leave Boston and move here to Europe. And this is a sculpture by Miguel Ortiz Barrocal, a Spanish artist who lived in Italy. And it's a puzzle sculpture. It's made of 16 interlocking elements. I have not tried to take it apart. There is a video that you can watch, and we have a link to it on the lot listing on our website that a museum has put together with someone very carefully taking it apart. So you could see how it comes apart. It's called Romeo and Julieta. So it's Romeo and Juliet intertwined, and it comes with this instruction booklet that reminds me a lot of the instruction booklets that come with big Lego projects that one of my daughters loves to do. Each page has indicated with different colors, these are the elements you're working on this page. And I was corresponding with the estate of the artist, and they advised me that if I were to try to take it apart, I thought maybe I could make a video to do that. But if I were to do that, it would probably, even following these instructions, take me several days the first time I tried it. So I didn't want to risk it and not be able to put it back together. It is polished brass, and they also told me that the type of brass polish I should get to make it very shiny. but this comes with it, this booklet, and is also its certificate of authenticity. There's a companion piece that's a separate artwork that is called Il Cofanetto, the little coffin, and it's the coffin for Romeo and Juliet. And this is a picture of it. I don't know if you can see it, but it is also a puzzle, and it comes apart to create, all of the pieces create a dinner service for two, comprised of cutlery, candlesticks, goblets, and it's not big. It's maybe 20 centimeters by 15 centimeters. I'm not even sure what that converts to in inches. Do you know this? But it's smallish, and these are, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it creates all of these pieces of the dinner service. And then the box itself becomes a chafing dish. And this top part of the box becomes a stand for the sculpture that will be your centerpiece for your dinner party for two. There's also a ring, 2 rings, one for each person at the dinner to wear. So it's very interesting. These things, I think the idea comes from these Chinese puzzles that I'm not actually familiar with, but from reading about them, they have one key piece, you take it out, it all falls apart, and you try to put it back together. This, though, when you take out the first piece, it doesn't fall apart, it all stays together, but it's equally as difficult to put back together. So it appeals to people who like puzzles, but also as a piece of fine art. He made 2,000 of these in polished brass, and his idea was that everybody should be able to have one. And then he made maybe a smaller number, maybe about 8 of them in gold, and maybe 15 of them in sterling silver. And those ones have a key that the owner can lock it so that no one else can take it apart, lest they decide to steal parts of it because they're 18 karat gold or something like that. So then I want to go back to Boston now and show you this sculpture back here by Dimitri Hatzi, an artist who was born in New York, then studied, put these down out of the way, and then studied and worked in Europe, in Greece and Italy for about 25 years, and then moved to Cambridge in 1975 when he became a professor at Harvard. He was of Greek origin. His family was Greek. He was very interested in antiquity and Greek mythology. This sculpture is called Talos, and I can't really figure out the story of it. I assume it's based on the Greek mythological character Talos, who was supposed to have been a monumental bronze automaton that protected Crete from invaders by throwing stones at them. And the story is that he had a nail or a plug near his ankle that held closed the one vein in his body that held his life force. And I think when Jason and the Argonauts came to Crete, somebody in their group unplugged his vein and his life force flowed out of him. So I don't see, Hatzi's work is abstract for sure. So I didn't really understand what the title was, but today I came up with the idea. There is a circle here with a tiny circle in it that looks to me, maybe this is the plug. And that's where the idea of Talos comes in, that this would be the plug near his ankle for the vein. But I always I love Hatzi's work and appreciate it more as an abstract, not really having a story with it. I've never really investigated many of the stories. These also, we see these often in Boston. They're all different sizes. There are some monumental public ones at Harvard, at MIT, in the Back Bay, and in downtown Boston. And there are ones that are 5 feet tall, ones that are 4 feet tall, and ones that are this size and even smaller. He worked in stone and bronze predominantly. And they're just, I think, really lovely. And this is a nice size and would be a great addition to anyone's home. And now I'm going to turn the camera over to our specialist in photography, James Leighton.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is James Leighton. I'm the new photograph specialist here at Skinner. I'll be talking tonight about George Platt Lyons. But first, I'd like to set the stage with a brief reading from a biography on Lyons, and this is penned by the painter Bernard Ferlin. George Platt Lyons was the prototypical established gay man of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He personified everything most homosexual men strove for: to be extraordinarily handsome, successful in his work, with universal recognition and status, living a princely life in excellent style, having a prodigious sex life, plus love affairs that were serious and meaningful. He was a role model for us. He was the epitome of a stylish life, also an artist's life, successful and admired. He brought his aesthetic home and used it to create superbly elegant and luxurious life. He was style. He was so princely that he would have been quite at home in the 18th century. George Platt Lyons was born in 1907, and straight after high school, he traveled to Paris, and in the ensuing years bounced back and forth between stints in France and his parents' attics. On his first trip, he met Gertrude Stein, who quickly nicknamed him Baby George. He worked in literary circles in the 1920s, opening a bookshop in New Jersey, which he operated for only a brief period and turned it around for a profit within a year. After he repaid his loans, he booked himself a return trip to Paris with the goal of writing a novel. Ultimately, he was unsuccessful, but upon his return in 1929, he secured a lot of professional camera equipment and really dove straight in to teaching himself the craft of photography. Bouncing back and forth between Paris and New York, Lyons honed his craft by photographing the social scene. In the early 1930s, he had an exhibition at the Wadsworth Athenaeum and shortly after at the influential Julian Levy Gallery. The New York Gallery was known for exhibiting avant-garde artists and photographers in the 1930s and 40s. The exhibition with Lyons was paired with photographs of Walker Evans, whose deadpan depictions of America in the Depression era must have made for odd bedfellows, paired with Lyons's stylized celebrity portraits. The sale includes 20 plus lots of photographs by Lyons and includes this theatrical self-portrait from 1945. And here Lyons is dressed as a harlequin in a harlequin costume, and the photograph was made while attending a masquerade ball on Halloween. In the mid-1930s, Lyons expanded his photography market to begin making fashion photographs. And he worked for magazines including Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, and also photographed for Saks Fifth Avenue. His highly stylized photographs made him one of the most sought after fashion photographers in New York. At approximately the same time, Lyons became the official photographer of the American Ballet of New York City, which was under the direction of Lincoln Kirstein, an acclaimed writer, curator, and co-founder of the ballet. Lyons and Kirstein first met in boarding school in Western Massachusetts, and his choice of Lyons goes back to the formative years that they spent in their youth. Lyons' photographs of the ballet are often described as some of the most interesting and expressive of the ballet ever produced, and he served as the company's photographer for the remainder of his career. I'm going to shuffle through a number of photographs this evening, so I apologize for the dance. Lyons was an avid entertainer. His early success in as a fashion photographer can be attributed to his social status. He is described as hosting lavish dinner parties in his decorated New York apartments. At its height, his art collection included paintings by Paul Cadmus, Marston Hartley, Paul Klee, and Picasso. He hosted parties once a month that were known to include a mix of socialites, artists, and beautiful young New Yorkers. Lyons often served as bartender, even though he has confessed to only knowing how to make a Manhattan and a martini. It was at one of these monthly parties that Lyons introduced Fidelma Cadmus, sister of the painter Paul Cadmus, to Lincoln Kirstein. Here, Kirstein proclaimed, "I'm going to marry your sister one day," to which Paul replied, "But Lincoln, she's nothing at all like me." Their marriage blanc continued for the next 50 years. In 1946, Lyons moved to Los Angeles to head Vogue's Hollywood studio. Here he churned out celebrity portraits but never found artistic satisfaction. Having badly managed his finances, he returned to New York the next year. The circle of George Bott Lyons was large and included many New York-based artists. Lincoln Kirstein and the Pajama Group of Paul Cadmus, Jared French, and Margaret French were central to his social life. Chuck Howard, who many of the photographs in this group are of, was central to that group as well. He entered the circle of Lyons in the post-war years. And while serving in the Navy, Howard first met the painter Bernard Perlin, who through their friendship introduced him to Lyons. Howard quickly became a favorite model for many of the artists in that circle, and his sculptural physique was a favorite for artists including Cadmus, Jared French, Bernard Perlin, and George Tooker. Howard quickly caught the eye of Lyons, and he modeled for him extensively over the course of their relationship. Howard was stationed in Hawaii during the war, and after completing his service and with the help of the GI Bill, he traveled to Paris to study dress design. At the time of their meeting, Howard was an aspiring fashion designer. His career took off in the late 1950s when he produced a line of sporty men's fashions. He worked in the 1960s for Anne Klein, and his assistant at the time was Donna Karan. In a series of photographs by Lyons, including this one here, Fidelma Cadmus Kirstein can be seen in a velvet evening gown that was likely designed by Chuck Howard. I really hope I'm shuffling the right photographs. Once Howard entered Lyons' realm, he quickly became his muse, and their relationship was all-encompassing. He sat for photographs, both professional and personal, and the works in this group offer a look into both. Fashion images are reminiscent of his editorial work that he produced in the 1930s, and intimate portraits made in the bedroom where the guise of performance drops away completely. No event was off limits. Lyons photographed Howard in the studio, publicly on the beach, or while away on holiday. Contact sheets that are a part of this offer show that his process was a collaboration, as he often made appearances within the roles of the film. Financially at odds after his return from California, Howard acted as a steadying force, and their relationship was strongly encouraged by the friends within the group. Their relationship came to a close early in 1951, and Lyons, an avid letter writer, recalls in a letter to his mother, "Late last week, Chuck decided to go off and live by himself. It's a pity, for I shall miss him, but I don't disapprove. I'm afraid that my influence is often all-pervading, all-inclusive." Many of the personal photographs that Lyons made during his career remained private. It was an open secret that he made erotic male photographs, but if they were ever made public, it could be detrimental not only to the photographer, but also to the sitters in the pictures. For that reason, much of his work was never published or publicly viewed at the time. And in fact, many of the models that he photographed remain anonymous today. Reviewing the versos of many of the prints in the groups, in some cases you'll see the photographer's stamp, which bears his name and studio address. These are some of the works that were produced for public consumption, whether for editorial use or advertising. However, the more personal works rarely, if ever, contain the artist's signature or titles that could identify the sitter. In the late 1940s, Dr. Alfred Kinsey, author of Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, was in the process of opening a research institute at Indiana University. He sought out Lyons for discussions on erotic art. Even though it was illegal to buy or sell photographs of nude male men, he managed to secure hundreds of photographs and negatives for the Kinsey Institute, which offered a much needed lifeline for Lyons. In 1955, shuffle. In 1955, Lyons was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. And at the time, he closed his studio, and it was reported that he had destroyed all of his personal work. But thankfully, the majority of the work had already been transferred to the Kinsey Institute and exists today. The ownership history of these photographs is perhaps as equally interesting as the works themselves. They had been held privately since their creation, and many remain unpublished today. Given by the artist to Chuck Howard in the early 1950s, they've only been viewed privately since. Howard and his spouse, Ed Vaughn, shared the photographs with trusted guests during dinner parties. The current owner recalls that at these parties, Howard would bring out a box of photographs that he referred to as the baby pictures, and over many glasses of wine, he would go into great detail in the background and the who's who of everyone in the pictures. Over the years, the current owner spent many celebrations with Howard and Vaughn, often spilling over the photographs. And shortly before Vaughn's passing, he entrusted the current owner with them, and he has held the desire for them to find a public audience. The lineage of Lyons continues with photographers working into the 20th century, later in the 20th century, sorry. Herb Ritz emulated the photographs of the male nude, often creating photographs in a similar composition of Lyons, where the male figure is glorified as statuesque. Lyons also opened the door for photographers such as Bruce Weber, whose fashion photographs turned the typical male gaze on women towards a sexualized view of men. The line continued with Robert Mapplethorpe, who further pushed the boundaries that explored male sexuality. Today, Lyons' photographs live on and are appreciated for their groundbreaking exploration of male sexuality. Photographs from the Kinsey Institute were featured in a retrospective at the Indianapolis Museum of Art in 2019, and were heavily featured in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition, Lincoln Kirstein's Modern, also in 2019. I welcome you to join my colleague Robin Starr for some discussion on pop art, and thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, James. So I wanted to start by talking about pop art. We have a great collection of pop works. I'm not going to talk about them all, don't panic, but I just wanted to talk about a few highlights. Now, pop art gets its name from the integration of popular commercialized culture into art. And pop art, to horribly oversimplify, was basically a reaction to the big trend of the day, and that was, of course, abstract expressionism. The abstract expressionists such as de Kooning, Frankenthaler, Pollock, Rothko, they all found traditional representational art to be very elitist. In order to understand most of the art in museums, you had to have a very sophisticated knowledge of Greek and Roman mythology, the Old and New Testament, as well as Christian iconography. You had to know literature from all over the Western world, from ancient to modern. You had to know the same histories of all of the Western world, from ancient to modern. So it was very, very difficult for just the so-called common man to look at traditional art. They felt that using the same elements traditional artists used, line, color, brushstroke, space, modeling, they could express things that are feelings that we all have. Virtually everybody knows how to emote. Everybody has feelings, and their interest was in using paint and composition to express those feelings. Well, there is a reaction back against that, and pop art basically brings representation back into art with a twist. It's using things that are very recognizable, certainly not elitist, but they are things that everybody in the American culture would have recognized from mass media, from advertising, from television, from the movies. So it's everything from mundane objects that every American household might have, like a box of Brillo pads or a can of Campbell's soup, to images of famous Hollywood starlets like Marilyn Monroe and Liz Taylor. Now, When Warhol was working during the 1950s as abstract expressionism was the scene, Warhol was working as an advertising illustrator. As a young kid, he was fascinated with photography. By the age of 9, he had a darkroom in the family house in the basement. And by the age of 11, he had a vast collection of photographs of movie stars. He started taking classes, art classes, and ended up at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, where he studied and became a commercial artist. He was mostly working on illustrations for fashion, so especially drawings of shoes. And these drawings were usually very linear and very simple. And he, even at that moment in time, because he was so immersed into commercial art, was very aware of sort of mass production. And he was interested in devising techniques where he could create images that were infinitely and easily mass produced. When he really hit his own stride, he was using those sort of linear ideas and those reproductive ideas, and he coupled those with his interest in photography. So really, his ultimate style, as we're seeing here in this image of Frank Kafka, was almost predetermined, that combination of photographs of the rich and famous and linear style. So this particular work is very much an epitome of his high style. It is an image of Franz Kafka. And this was actually part of a portfolio called 10 Portraits of Jews of the 20th Century. Warhol liked to call it Jewish geniuses. But as much as this may not be somebody who is famous in the way that Marilyn Monroe or Jackie Kennedy or Elvis was, he's still somebody who's famous. And we all know Warhol was fascinated with fame. Remember, Warhol was the man who told us that in the future, every one of us would be famous for 15 minutes. Now, up above Warhol, I have 2 works by Roy Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein didn't really care about fame and fortune. He actually came from more of the academic side of arts. He grew up in New York City on the west side, sort of on the other side of Central Park from the Guggenheim. By the age of 14, he was already taking Saturday painting classes at the Parsons School of Design. He ultimately went to Ohio State. He started at the beginning of the 1940s, had to take a little break in his studies to serve in World War II, and then came back to finish up his degree and then ultimately taught there. He also taught briefly at one of the New York State universities and ultimately at Rutgers. It was at Rutgers that he met a number of very similar-minded artists, including Klaus Oldenburg and Jim Dine. In 1962, he's given a show by Leo Castelli at the famous Castelli Gallery, and this is his jumping off point. Here he features his images. His images are not popular and famous people. They're not mundane objects from everywhere. Roy Lichtenstein's connection to pop is his actual physical style. If you look closely, obviously you're seeing, as you look at this crying girl over here, you're seeing the deep black outlines, the very simple forms, and most importantly, you're seeing that the flesh in this particular image is made up of teeny tiny dots called Ben-Day dots. Those are the same dots that anybody growing up in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s would have been familiar with from reading comic books and looking at the Sunday funnies. So his vocabulary is actually borrowed from comic books. And yet the works are not meant to be comic at all. In looking at the crying girl, there are a number of theories about where the theme might have actually come from. One supposition is that it may have something to do with Picasso's images of crying women. A more mundane possibility is that it related to the fact that his marriage to Isabel Wilson was in the process of falling apart. They actually divorced 3 years after this was created. We look at this, and what we might see on the surface, since it's pop art, is we might just see an interesting little tidbit of a narrative. And it might invite us, indeed it does invite us, to suppose, well, what is the rest of the narrative? And it leaves us open to use our imaginations. But what you might not know is Roy Lichtenstein wasn't just trying to create melodramatic comic book images. He was actually very interested in the psychology of women, and in particular of women who were in relationships with relatively domineering men, and how those relationships would affect the emotions of those women. So when you're looking at this, it's not just a comic book. It's actually a very deep dive into the woman's psychology. I want to move on to one other object. It's not pop art, but if you want to circle around with me. I want to take a peek at something a little bit different. This is a much more contemporary work. This is from 1992, and it's by Via Selmans. And she is a very interesting artist and one of my personal favorites. She grew up in Latvia in a town called Riga. And she had a very tumultuous childhood, not because there was family strife or difficulties, but because Latvia was taken over by the Soviets a couple of years after she was born. So in 1939, her entire family had to flee Latvia. And in 39, they ended up in a series of refugee camps in Germany, which is just where you want to be, Nazi Germany in the late 30s and early 40s. So they shunted around from refugee camp to refugee camp, basically for the first 10 years of her life. Ultimately, they ended up, the family was settled in Indianapolis. As you might well imagine, Via had a tough time, but as a teenager, she found great solace in drawing, and her mother was thrilled, and her teachers encouraged her in that as well. And so she drew very extensively. She was originally very, very interested in abstract expressionism, as that was the fine art of the day. And then in 1961, she went to do the summer program at Yale University. And here she meets Bryce Marsden and Chuck Close, and they have a tremendous influence on her. And she starts thinking very differently. She's also introduced and becomes sort of obsessed with the monotone still lifes of Giorgio Morandi, who you may know. So with this sort of all churning in the back of her mind, she goes to UCLA to work on her MFA. And here she starts to become obsessed with photorealism. And with photorealism, the subjects she starts to focus on are the subjects of her youth. So images of warplanes, of guns, all of the things that are still in the back of her psyche from her childhood. But as she approaches these, they have that monochromatic palette that she really learned from Morandi's still lives. And then as she continued to work later into the 60s and into the 70s, she shifted to subjects that were much more calming and contemplative. She stuck to that photorealism sort of image, such as you're seeing here, but she started doing detailed images wildly detailed, of waves and sand dunes and the surfaces of seashells, and eventually the stars in the heavens. This particular work is called Comet, and it's probably hard to see, and I apologize, you'll just have to go on the website and take a peek. But if you look very closely right here, there's a very small comet dashing through the sky. Now, her works are very much photorealist. They are incredibly realistic, and yet at the same time, because of the way she approaches her subjects, they're also very abstract. And that's one of the things I really love about her. She sticks to that monochromatic palette. And while we're used to that from photography, it's hardly how the world really looks. But if you take a look at this and think about this night sky, and then remember back to your childhood, remember how maybe as a kid you used to lie out in the grass and stare up at the stars at night, and you would just wonder at the vastness, and you would look at the light. But even as you were lying in the grass looking at the stars, you were aware in your peripheral vision, maybe of a line of trees just in the corner of your eye. You were aware maybe of light pollution, of a city nearby. You were still grounded on the earth. But because she has taken away horizon line and any reference to the earth, it suddenly becomes extremely abstract. She could have given us an earthly reference point, a rocket ship or an airplane flying through. But the closest we get is that comet. So even though it's incredibly realistic, because of her perspective and her approach, it also becomes very abstract. And that's one of the things that really appeals to me about her work. These are just a few of the objects. We tried to pick things we really loved to share with you. And I think at this point, what I'd like to do is Carrie Shrives is here to help us. If you have entered any questions in the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen in that little black band at the bottom, please feel free to type them in, and Carrie is going to feed us some of those different questions. So we're going to meet over here in the middle, and so we can take turns at your questions. So why don't we do a couple at times, socially distanced, but so we can always be in, and we can sort of switch in and out if you have questions for particular ones of us.
While we're waiting for questions, you want to talk a little bit about when the sales are happening, how it's divided?
Absolutely. So Prints and Photographs is an online only auction. It's running now and it runs through the 20th, which is Thursday. Lots begin to close at 7 p.m. So you can put your bids in at any time. And please feel free to do so. You can just put in a nice big huge bid, or if you prefer, you can just bid one increment at a time. If you put in a bid and you get outbid, you'll get an email letting you know you've been outbid, so you won't miss out. And then we will have a virtual live auction, which will be much like this event. It will be live, but it will be online. That will start at 10 a.m. on Friday, the 21st. And you can bid through that online once again, but you can also register for a telephone bid or an absentee bid. And we'll have an auctioneer, myself and Karen Keaton, at the podium. And we'll be selling that sale live like a good old-fashioned auction. The only change will be nobody will be in the room with a paddle. But we hope to welcome you back soon for that as well. Questions?
We don't have a lot of questions. You covered a lot of territory with the ones that you looked at. Anything else you'd like to add? And
I think other than that, all we would like to do is thank you all for coming and for listening. Cheers if you have your beverage. And we hope to see you online and in person again soon. Do keep in mind you can make appointments to come and preview in person.
we have a question that's just come in. The writer says, it's been a while since I've really checked in with the master with the print market. Seems like the prices are quite affordable. Can you speak a little bit about print and photography market? Is it time to buy? Any suggestions for either lapsed collectors or new collectors?
So regarding prints, I'll start with prints and then I'll ask James to come in for photographs. The rule of thumb right now is, as always, buy what you love. The hottest things right now are modern and contemporary prints. The bigger and more blue chip a name, the more you're going to be paying. If you're not terribly interested or not able to pay a top dollar or a huge price, think about things like old master prints and even things like late 19th and early 20th century American etchings. People like Frank Benson, John Taylor Arms, that sort of group, those used to bring lots of money, and right now you can pick them up very affordably. And a lot of the other artists, even people like Whistler, unless you're getting a particular unusual image, like say one of his Venetian scenes, they really can be bought very affordably. The other thing that I would say for this, and I suspect James will echo it, is watch for condition. Multiples, prints are multiples, photographs are multiples. So condition really matters. A seemingly minor condition problem for a drawing actually is a major deal for prints and for photographs, because of course, for every one out there that's in condition, there's 5 others that are in terrific condition. I'm a cheap Yankee. I'm not going to buy the one in bad condition. I'm going to buy hold up for one in great condition. So those are the things I would think about. James, do you have anything to add from the photography perspective?
So I might add, in terms of affordability in photographs, we have works by a few artists that are made later or made posthumously. There's a group of photographs by Imogen Cunningham, a revolutionary photographer of the 20th century. Her career pretty much spanned from the early 1900s through the 1970s, and we have 6 or 7 of her photographs that are all posthumously printed. They're beautiful prints, but because of that, because they weren't made by the artist's hand, they tend to go for a more modest price point. Along the same lines, there's a group of Bernice Abbott prints that are modestly estimated, and then there's also a group of Eugene Attier photographs, which were made after his lifetime, so those will be relatively moderate price point as well. So we're hoping that the storage flat lines will get some great interest, so fade away.
Other questions?
That wraps it up for the questions. Thank you all.
Again, thanks so much for coming, and we hope to see you here for previews, and we hope to see you online. Good night, all.